Iran just launched a wave of what its own side described as heavy multi-warhead missiles toward Israel. And before this turns into another shouting match online, let's slow the whole thing down and ask the question that actually matters. What do these weapons really do? Because in a moment like this, the fastest thing on the internet is not the missile. It's the exaggeration. People hear the phrase multi-warhead and instantly jump to the most extreme interpretation possible. Some imagine a single missile acting like science fiction. Others assume every defense system becomes useless the moment one of these launches. And neither reaction helps you understand what is actually happening. So in this video, I want to do something different. No panic language. No pretending we know more than we do. No dramatic claims that outrun the evidence. Just a clear breakdown of what was reportedly launched, what multi-warhead most likely means in this context, why it matters for Israel's defenses, and what these weapons can actually do in the real world. First, here's the basic situation. Footage released by Iranian state media and described by Al Jazeera showed what Iran called a wave of heavy multi-warhead missiles. Interceptions were seen over Israel, and there were also reports of at least one hit in Tel Aviv. That much places this in the category of a real operational event, not just rhetoric. But the phrase doing all the work here is multi-warhead, and that phrase can mean very different things depending on the system involved. That distinction is everything. When many people hear multi-warhead missile, they think of MIRVs, a term from strategic nuclear weapons. A MIRV is a missile that carries multiple re-entry vehicles that can be released after the boost phase and sent on separate trajectories. In its classic form, that is a very specific category of weapon associated with long-range nuclear arsenals, but that is not automatically what every news report means when it says multi-warhead. In regional conflicts, the phrase may instead refer to a missile carrying submunitions, sometimes described as a cluster-type warhead. In other words, rather than one single explosive payload, staying intact all the way to impact, the warhead can open during descent and disperse multiple smaller bomblets over a wider area. That difference matters because it changes both the purpose of the weapon and the defensive problem it creates. If a missile carries one large conventional warhead, the main concern is the impact point and the blast effects at that point. If the missile instead breaks open and scatters multiple submunitions, the danger becomes wider, messier, and in some ways harder to manage. Not necessarily because each bomblet is individually more powerful, but because the footprint grows, the threat spreads, the uncertainty spreads, and the burden on civilians and emergency responders spreads too. That is why reporting from AP on this conflict matters here. AP said Israeli officials reported Iran had been using cluster munitions, and the weapons identified in reporting included the Khorramshahr and Zulfiqar families, with warheads described as carrying roughly 20 to 24 submunitions. AP also noted something crucial. Once those submunitions disperse, they become much harder to intercept, and any unexploded ordnance left behind can remain dangerous after the initial strike. That is the first big takeaway. A multi-warhead or submunition-style missile does not just try to hit one point. It can try to complicate defense, widen the hazard zone, and create lingering risk after the air raid sirens stop. Now let's talk about what these weapons can actually do, and just as importantly, what they cannot do. What they can do is force a defender into a tougher geometry problem. Israel's missile defense architecture is layered. Reuters explainer laid out the basics. Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 are designed for longer-range ballistic missile threats, with Arrow 3 intended for intercepts outside the atmosphere. David's Sling is for medium-range threats, and Iron Dome is primarily for shorter-range rockets. On top of that, US-supplied THAAD can add another ballistic missile defense layer. That layered system is sophisticated, but layered does not mean magical. Missile defense works best when the threat is identified early, tracked cleanly, and engaged before it creates extra complexity. A missile, carrying submunitions, creates that extra complexity by compressing time and multiplying objects. If the missile is intercepted early enough, ideally before the warhead can disperse, that is one kind of defensive problem. If it gets further along and releases smaller bomblets, the challenge changes. Now the defender may be dealing with multiple falling objects, a wider area of risk, and less certainty about where everything will land. Even if the main missile body is no longer the issue, the danger is not over. That is one reason these weapons attract so much concern from humanitarian groups and military planners alike. But it is also important to say what these weapons do not automatically mean. They do not mean air defense has failed completely. They do not mean every missile gets through. They do not mean one launch equals strategic collapse. And they do not mean every use of the phrase multi-warhead should be treated as proof of a MIRV-style breakthrough. A lot of people online collapse all those ideas into one dramatic sentence because it sounds powerful. But once you do that, you stop informing the audience and start misleading them, so let's stay disciplined. The smarter way to understand these reported launches is this. If Iran is using missiles that disperse multiple bomblets or submunitions, then the practical effect is to make interception more demanding, increase the area at risk on the ground, and potentially leave behind unexploded hazards. That is already serious enough. It does not need embellishment. Now, what missile families are most relevant here? One name that keeps coming up in public reporting is Khorramshahr. CSIS missile threat describes the Khorramshahr as an Iranian liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile with a reported range of about 2,000 kilometers. That range matters because it places Israel within its potential envelope, depending on launch location and flight profile. The significance of a missile like that is not just distance, it is payload flexibility. Heavier missile families can be adapted for different warhead arrangements, and that is part of why analysts pay such close attention to them. A heavier payload can support a larger conventional warhead, or it can be configured in ways that trade a single concentrated strike for wider area effects. That brings us back to the phrase, what these weapons can actually do. They can disrupt normal assumptions about where danger is concentrated. With a single impact missile, civilians, responders, and commanders think in terms of one likely strike point and one main blast zone. With submunition carrying systems, the hazard can be distributed over a broader area. That affects sheltering, damage assessment, medical response, bomb disposal, and public warning systems. It also has a psychological effect, not because we need dramatic language, but because the nature of the threat changes how people experience it. A single impact is terrifying, but it is also finite and visible. A dispersed attack introduces uncertainty. People do not just fear the impact, they fear what may still be on the ground afterward. That uncertainty can disrupt schools, roads, cleanup operations, and return to normal timelines even when the immediate casualty count is lower than worst-case fears. And that point matters because the public often judges a weapon only by the size of the explosion on camera. That is a mistake. Some weapons are designed not just to destroy, but to complicate, to stretch defenses, to widen emergency burdens, to force expensive interception decisions, to keep civilians and authorities dealing with consequences after the first strike is over. That is part of why cluster-style warheads remain so controversial internationally. AP noted that more than 120 countries have banned cluster munitions, even though Iran, Israel, and the United States are not parties to that treaty regime. The humanitarian concern is not theoretical. It is tied to wide area effects and the risk of unexploded ordnance remaining dangerous. Now let's address the common question people are asking. If Israel has Arrow, David's Sling, Iron Dome, and support from partners, why is this still a problem? Because defense is not a yes or no switch. It is a probability game. Every layer improves the odds. Every sensor, interceptor, and engagement window matters. But no serious military planner describes missile defense as perfect. It is designed to reduce damage, protect population centers, and improve survival under attack. It is not a promise that nothing will ever land. And with ballistic missiles, especially heavier ones, the timing is brutal. Detection, classification, trajectory calculation, engagement choice, interceptor launch, and kill assessment all happen under enormous time pressure. If the incoming weapon has a warhead that can split or disperse, that timing pressure becomes even more important. This is where sensational commentary usually goes off the rails. You will hear people say things like, these missiles make all defenses obsolete. Or, on the other side, these are just propaganda weapons with no real effect. Both takes are lazy. The better answer is that these weapons test defenses in specific ways. They can stress tracking. They can complicate interception timing. They can widen the damage footprint. They can create lingering hazards. But they are still operating against one of the most layered missile defense environments in the world. So the real-world outcome depends on launch numbers, timing, trajectory, defensive readiness, and whether the warhead is engaged before or after it disperses. That is why the right mindset here is not certainty. It is disciplined uncertainty. We know enough to say the threat is serious. We do not know enough to turn every headline into an absolute conclusion. Now, let's talk about what viewers should understand when they hear "hit on Tel Aviv" or see videos of interceptions. Interceptions in the sky can look reassuring, but they do not necessarily mean zero danger on the ground. Debris can still fall, and if a missile or its warhead disperses before a successful intercept, smaller hazards may still reach the surface. On the other hand, a reported hit does not automatically tell you the scale of the damage, the type of warhead, or whether the intended military effect was achieved. This is one of the biggest mistakes in online war coverage, treating every visual as self-explanatory. It is not. A streak in the sky is not a complete story. A flash on the ground is not a complete story. A single dramatic frame tells you almost nothing about interception altitude, warhead type, spread pattern, or battle damage. That is exactly why this conversation needs to stay anchored to verified reporting and established technical basics. So let's sum up the practical meaning of these reported multi-warhead launches. If the reporting is correct that at least some of these missiles use cluster-type or submunition warheads, then the purpose is likely not only to strike, but to complicate defense and widen hazard areas. these missiles can create multiple falling threats instead of one terminal impact point. They can challenge interception if the release happens late enough in flight. They can produce casualties and damage across a broader area than a single impact warhead, and they can leave dangerous unexploded ordnance behind, extending the risk beyond the moment of attack. At the same time, they are not a magic weapon. They do not erase Israel's air defenses. They do not guarantee mass casualties on every launch. And they do not justify irresponsible claims that everything people feared most is suddenly already here. There is another important point here that often gets missed. Words like heavy, advanced, or multi-warhead can be technically meaningful, but they are also politically useful. Governments use language strategically in wartime. Militaries use it to signal capability, shape perceptions, and influence deterrence. That does not mean the weapon is fake. It means the description itself is part of the information battle. So when Iran describes a launch as heavy and multi-warhead, analysts have to separate three layers: the propaganda layer, the technical layer, and the battlefield result layer. The propaganda layer asks, what image is the sender trying to create? The technical layer asks, what kind of warhead arrangement is this likely to be? And the battlefield result layer asks, what actually happened after launch? Those are not the same question, and when people merge them, bad analysis spreads fast. That is why a responsible script on this topic has to resist two temptations at once. First, the temptation to underplay the risk because some interceptions were visible. Second, the temptation to overstate the risk because multi-warhead sounds apocalyptic. The evidence supports a more measured conclusion. These reported launches matter because they point to a weapon type designed to make defense and civil protection harder. They matter because even a successful defensive system faces greater complexity when an incoming warhead disperses into multiple hazards. They matter because the humanitarian risk can continue after impact through unexploded bomblets. And they matter because the phrase multi-warhead suggests Iran wants both a tactical effect and a messaging effect. What should viewers watch for next? Three things. First, whether more verified reporting clarifies which missile families were used in this specific wave. That matters because range, payload, and likely warhead behavior differ by system. Second, whether official briefings distinguish clearly between independently targetable multiple re-entry vehicles and conventional submunition-style warheads. That distinction is technical, but it changes how the public should understand the threat. Third, whether post-strike reporting focuses on unexploded ordnance, damage spread, and the timing of interceptions. Those details tell you much more about what these weapons actually did than dramatic phrases ever will. And there is one final point I want to leave you with. In coverage like this, being accurate is not the enemy of retention. It is the foundation of trust. You do not need to tell people the sky is falling when the facts are already serious. You do not need to invent certainty where there is none. And you do not need to turn every weapons discussion into a cinematic monologue about the end of the world. Sometimes the strongest script is the one that tells the audience, here is what we know, here is what we do not know, and here is why the verified part is already important enough. So if you take one thing away from this story, let it be this. The most plausible reading of these reported multi-warhead missile launches is not that we are suddenly looking at an unstoppable science fiction weapon. It is that we are looking at a more complex and potentially more hazardous conventional missile threat. One that can widen the danger area, complicate interception, and increase risks to civilians on the ground. That is serious. That is newsworthy. And that is exactly why it needs to be explained carefully.